The classification of an Uber driver is important under Illinois law. Now, Uber will and has argued throughout the country that the folks that drive vehicles for Uber on Uber's behalf are what they call independent contractors. Now, why do they make that argument? Well, they're using their own vehicles. They typically don't require them to take rides. They don't pay their health insurance benefits. They're not a W 2 employee. All of these things are all part of the analysis as to whether or not an Uber driver, their negligence or recklessness or intentional conduct towards you in some way, whether they can be liable. So that classification is interesting. But in Illinois, employees as well as independent contractors can be liable on behalf of Uber. So to put it another way, Uber can be liable for the acts of its independent contractors as well as its employees. And the issue is whether or not Uber had the right to control them at the time of the crash. Those are issues that, in fact, our law firm was involved in one of the most landmark cases in the country, in that there was a case that we handled about a decade ago against this company called C.H. Robinson. C.H. Robinson always classified anybody that drove for them as an independent contractor. And they basically thought that the companies that they hired were independent contractors, as well as the drivers for those rigs were independent contractors. I believe that our lawsuit against C.H. Robinson and its negligent driver was one of the first in the country to have a judgment against C.H. Robinson as an employer or as a principal for their agent, the driver, and the company. That was appealed by C.H. Robinson and went all the way to the appellate court and the Illinois Supreme Court. And that is where the jury instruction in Illinois was interpreted as to whether or not C.H. Robinson had a right to control the driver at the time of the crash. Now, in that case, that driver was driving a load that was brokered by C.H. Robinson, and they had this driver checking in with them periodically. They had control over a number of different things for that driver. The same type of analysis would apply in the case of an Uber driver or a Lyft driver. At the time of the crash, did the rideshare company, Uber or Lyft or another company, have the right to control that driver? And were the other factors involved that would be enough? Now, in Illinois, there's statutes, and in fact, in the city of Chicago, there's statutes that also affect the liability of the driver. And they have certain minimums for how old the driver needs to be. I believe it was 19 years old, what type of safety measures they have in the vehicle, what type of language in the contract, those types of things. So all those things need to be analyzed in every case to make sure that you, the victim of a personal injury on behalf of a driver of a vehicle that was affiliated with Uber or Lyft, would be liable. Uber or Lyft are going to classify their drivers the way that's their best interest. Typically, that's an independent contractor. When you are injured, you want to make sure that you use the benefit of the law in Illinois, which is set forth by the courts in Illinois jury instructions, statutes by the Illinois legislature, city code by the city of Chicago, or any other city that was involved where your accident happened. All those things need to be interpreted to make sure that the court understands exactly who should be liable in your case. Maybe it is only the Uber driver that was not driving at the time for Uber or Lyft, not engaged. It was a Saturday. They were in their car. There was no involvement of Uber. But what if it was a case where they were summoned and they were directed to pick up a ride and they hadn't picked anybody up yet? Are they liable at that time? That's a little bit more gray area, isn't it? It's not a gray area at all, is if they're in an active ride with a passenger. Why does Uber or Lyft want their drivers to be independent contractors? Uber and Lyft want to make a lot of money. They don't want to make a little bit of money. They want to make a lot of money. And the way they do that is they use a business way of using people without hiring them as W-2 employees. And that's called hiring somebody as a 1099 employee. If they do that, then they don't have to provide any health insurance coverage to the employee, right? They don't have to take out their taxes and pay extra taxes for that employee. They're not liable for workers' compensation typically. Sometimes they might be. They might be liable for workers' compensation because that is the application of the law in Illinois is going to apply rather than their own rules. You see, a company can make all their own rules. A national company like Uber or Lyft can write all the rules they want with respect to how they feel that they're going to be liable in a crash. But none of that matters if the criteria of Illinois law applies, because they're no different than anybody else. So there are gray areas that a lawyer needs to analyze as to whether or not a driver is an independent contractor with no liability to Uber, or whether or not they are a driver for Uber at the time of the crash. You see, the drivers can't set their own rates. They can't determine where they're going to pick somebody up or not. They're directed where to pick somebody up or drop them off. They're directed what the rates are. If they decline a ride, the question is there any sort of disincentive from Uber, or are they somehow punished for not accepting rides? That indicates control, doesn't it? That's another gray area under Illinois law. So all these things need to be considered by a lawyer in deciding whether or not that independent contractor for Uber, whether Uber should answer for that driver's conduct. So we've talked about insurance coverage that's provided by Uber for a loss. And so say that the $1 million coverage kicks in and the person that's injured, our client has a injury, they've lost both their legs, or they've have a brain injury and their injury is worth 10, 20 million. What happens then? Does Uber just walk away with writing a $1 million check? I don't think so. I think Uber has probably self-insured for a lot more money than that. So make sure that you seek every right that you have to secure as much coverage or payment from Uber, because why should you and your family suffer from a bad crash like that and let a big company like Uber or Lyft walk away with their own self-imposed insurance discipline? It's not there. There's got to be more insurance coverage available on top of that, and get a lawyer that will figure that out and make sure that you get paid.